Dear ladies and gentlemen, good evening, guten Abend, Yakshamalar. My name is Alcibiades Ginalis, and in the name of our entire department, I have the great pleasure to welcome you at today's webinar as part of the lecture series of the Istanbul department of the German Archaeological Institute. Our speakers today will take you to Constantinople in late antiquity and present or discuss some aspects of sacred space and urban topography. Therefore, I'm delighted to present our three speakers tonight. The first one is Fabian Stroth from the University of Freiburg, who will talk about Aios Polioctus, Princess of Early Byzantine Architecture. Fabian did his PhD in 2015 at the University of Heidelberg, where he also continued as a postdoc fellow until 2017. Since then, he's tenure-track professor at the University of Freiburg for Byzantine archaeology and art history. Among his wide range of activities in that field, I would like to mention especially his freshly printed monograph, which is the result of his PhD thesis, called Monogramm Kapitelle, die Justinianische Bauskulptur Konstantinopels als Textträger, published in Wiesbaden 2021. So whoever is interested in Justinianic capitals of Constantinople, it's freshly printed. Our second speaker is Alessandra Ricci, who basically does not need any introduction. She is very well known in the academic community. I nevertheless would like to mention that she did her PhD thesis at the University of Princeton in 2008, where she studied Byzantine archaeology and art history. Since then, she had been visiting lecturer at several universities, such as Cornell University, and also associate director at ANAMET. And since 2009, she is a full-time research and faculty member of the Department of Archaeology and History of Arts at Koç University, where she's currently professor for early Christian and Byzantine art and archaeology. She extensively published, and apart from her latest book on the reinterpretation of the Palace of Brias, she has two more monographs in progress, so we are all looking forward to them. And tonight she's going to present the intangible topography of late antique Constantinople, green and urban agricultural spaces. Last but not least, I'm glad to present our third speaker, my dear colleague Nadine Fearman. Nadine did her PhD last year, if I'm right, at the University of Constance, and she's currently a postdoc fellow at our department of the German Archaeological Institute here in Istanbul, where she continues her research on sacred space and landscape of Constantinople. Her PhD thesis, called Heraklius, der schwitzende Kaiser, die oströmische Monarchie in der ausgehenden Spätantike, is soon to be published in hard copy, but it's already available online. So whoever is interested in Heraklius, the sweating emperor, please just get into the page of the Greuter and download the PDF. I don't want to take you too long, but just before I hand over to Nadine, who is going to give a short introduction into today's topic, I would like to ask you to make potential questions in written form in the chat function of Zoom, if you want, also by including your name. And I'm going to read the questions after the papers and the discussion to the speakers. And with that, enjoy today's lecture evening, and I hand over to Nadine.
Yeah, thank you, Archiviades. I'm really delighted to welcome everyone to today's evening lecture. I have a very short introduction. And I'm just going to share my screen really quick. I hope you can see it now. Yes, looks good. Okay. Yeah, it's basically what's so interesting about Constantinople in late antiquity. When we think of Constantinople, the capital of the medieval Roman Empire, many things come to mind. The splendid imperial palaces, the hippodrome, the imperial fora, the massive fortification, the elaborate water supply system. And of course, the countless churches, the most famous of which is undoubtedly the Hagia Sophia in the city center. Constantinople was regarded not only as New Rome, the political center of the Eastern Mediterranean, but also the New Jerusalem, the religious navel of Orthodox Christianity. As capital of the Roman Politeia, Constantinople would last, with one small interruption, for more than a millennium, until 1453. But what might seem self-evident in retrospect, namely the city's preeminence and its outstanding longevity, that is all but clear, or was all but clear in its beginning. The Emperor Constantine founded Constantinople in 324 Christian era at the site of the Greek settlement Byzantium. The dedication followed 6 years later in 313. At that point, Constantinople was, one could say, not more, but one of several imperial residences that had been established after the Roman emperors had successively distanced themselves from the old capital in Italy. Residences like Trier, Milan, Ravenna, Antioch, or Nicomedia. Constantinople, however, would quickly come to overshadow the cities just mentioned. It housed another senate that became equal to the one in Rome. In the first century of its existence, Constantinople underwent a remarkable growth. From the early 5th century on, the Eastern Roman emperors stopped traveling the empire and permanently settled in Constantinople. When the Western Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476, the city's importance further increased as undisputed capital of the Roman Empire. From a religious perspective, Constantinople was one in its early existence ambivalent, to say the least. Under Constantine, we have a remarkable balance between Christian and pagan connotations, which is exemplified by Constantine's column topped by a gilded statue of the emperor in the likeness of the god Sol Helios. Only gradually, over the decades and centuries, did the city gain its specifically Christian imprint that would shape its character for the centuries to come. My personal approach to Constantinople is led by a couple of very, very broad questions. How and why did Constantinople become the religious and political center of the Eastern Mediterranean? By what means did it gain its Christian imprint? Why was it so successful, surpassing the old Rome on the Italian peninsula? How could it build up this remarkable degree of resilience that allowed the city to survive under Roman rule for more than a millennium, despite internal and external threats? Obviously, there's no easy answer to that questions, but I think it is very productive to at least keep them in mind. Anyway, it's fair to say that the foundations of Constantinople as capital of the medieval Roman Empire were laid in late antiquity, the 4th to 7th century, broadly speaking. In order to understand the city's character and its longevity, we can't help but turn towards these formative and highly dynamic centuries. And this is what we're going to do today. The following presentations aim at highlighting different facets of Constantinople, of its character as political and religious center from archaeological, historical, and topographical perspectives. We're going to look at magnificent churches, at the city's intangible spaces, and at the impact of holy relics. All right, and that was my introduction. And I'm now very happy to hand over to my colleague, Fabian Stroth, with his presentation. And you can share your screen now, I guess.
Thank you very much, Nadine. Thank you very much, Nadine, for this invitation to this workshop. It's actually a chance to virtually visit Istanbul this year for me. And thank you also very much, Alcibiades, for this kind introduction. When talking about the sacred spaces in the urban topography of late antique Constantinople, one could think about several well-preserved structures, some of which already mentioned by Nadine in her introduction. But for the talk today, I have chosen a more enigmatic case, the famous but still puzzling Church of St. Polioctus. To get you in the mood, I show you here a reconstructed bird's eye view of Constantinople, just to briefly visualize some landmarks in the urban topography of the Eastern Roman Empire, capital. In the foreground, you can see the center of power, the vast areas of the imperial palace. Directly adjacent to the palace, you see the hippodrome, which, in addition to its primary function as a race course, is of importance as a place of communication between the emperor and the people. And of course, Hagia Sophia, which as a magnificent sacred space was the most important stage for the divinely legitimized Byzantine emperorship. You can also see the Mese, the main street of Constantinople. It starts in the Augusteon and continues to the west as the backbone of this city. The street is rhythmized by various public squares, of which the round forum of Constantine is always the most easy to identify. A good distance west from the Forum of Theodosius, the street splits and another strand turns right here and now runs in the northwest. And here we find the building we are going to talk about today, the Church of St. Polioctus. This structure, funded by the aristocratic princess Annika Juliana, is considered today one of the most important monuments of early Byzantine architectural history, along with Hagia Sophia, even though I think that Justinian would have disagreed with the sentence. The exact period of construction is disputed, but usually placed in the 520s, immediately before the erection of the major Justinianic buildings. The fact that we can record the location and shape of this architecture so accurately in the city map was not always the case. After the destruction of the building by an earthquake, probably in the 11th century, the knowledge about this important church was lost. The rediscovery of the church did not directly begin in Istanbul, but far away in Heidelberg. Already in the year 1606, a man called Claudius Salmasius came across an unknown Byzantine codex in the library, which is world famous today as the Valentine Anthology. This compilation of poems from the 9th, 10th century has a special value for the archaeology of Constantinople because it contains the epigrams of 123 buildings and artifacts from the city, most of which are lost today, including the complete copies of the 2 dedicatory epigrams of the Church of St. Polioctus. Only thanks to this manuscript, 350 years later, it will be possible to recognize the material remains of the church in Istanbul as such. A reconstruction of the building would have simply not been possible without this book. In spring 1960, During construction work in the Saraçhane district of Istanbul, bulldozers accidentally stumbled upon imposing and magnificently decorated marble blocks with remnants of an inscription. The archaeological significance of this discovery was quickly understood. The philologist E. Josefchenko promptly established a connection between the relief letters carved in marble and the text inscribed in ink in the Heidelberg manuscript. And the sensation was perfect. The famous church of St. Polioctus was rediscovered. Soon after its discovery, the building was included as a major work in the publication on Byzantine art history. First of all, it was famous for its architectural sculpture. What came to light during the excavation was a completely new world of forms, ornaments, and motifs. With the established narratives of Byzantine archaeology, this material could not be meaningfully located, and this is actually still true today. An explanation that assumes influences from Sasanian art receives much support so far. With the discovery of the first marble blocks on site, reused architectural sculptures in very different places could suddenly be recognized as memora disiecta of the Hagios Polioctus. In the picture, you can see the fragment of a council barrier from the church reused in the minbar of the Sedek Chami, better known to Byzantine archaeologists as the former Pantokrator monastery. Spectacular was the recognition of pieces from the church in distant places, such as Venice, Milan, Vienna, and even Barcelona. After the sack of Constantinople by Crusaders in 1204, the architectural sculptures arrived in European cities of the Mediterranean. There, the artifacts are involved in sometimes illustrious processes of cultural appropriation. The picture here shows the so-called Pilastri Acritani in front of the north facade of St. Marco in Venice. The pillars were reinterpreted in the communal memory of Venice as trophies of a victory over the rival city-state of Genoa in Akkon. Only the excavations in Istanbul have disproved this medieval propaganda. The fascination for this archaeological detective story, how Sir Stephen Runciman once used to call it, attached great expectations to the excavation work. The results, however, were sometimes received with disappointment by experts. In fact, all that remained of the architecture of what was once the most magnificent church in Constantinople were the remains of its massive substructures. Here in the picture, you can get a rough idea of its dimensions. The floor itself could be documented only at one single place, but not one rising wall above floor level remains. The whole complex of the church was about 50 meters wide and 100 meters long and was accessed from the west by a courtyard, the so-called atrium. The northern part of which was occupied by a domed apsidal building, most often referred to as a baptistry, or more recently as a parecclesion, which means it could also have been a burial chapel. The structure itself has an almost square shape, an apse in the east and several naves typical for a basilica. A puzzling component have been two massive foundation strips 7 meters wide, which run the entire length of the structure. The church itself sat on a monumental basement. This was the one uncovered during the excavation, so that the floor of the church rose 5 meters above the level of the courtyard. This is a very uncommon, or better to say, unique feature of Eastern Mediterranean church building. For this reason, the main portal was accessible only by an enormous staircase from the atrium. At the ground level, this staircase was flanked by 2 doors, descending a few steps to a cross-vaulted cryptoporticus below the narthex of the church. From there, 5 substructure corridors were accessible, which ran the entire length of the structure. Of note is the elaborate central corridor that wraps around the foundation of the ambo, to finish in a multi-part chamber system below the bema in the east. And as I know that you, Nadine, are particularly interested in relics and their accessibility, I will say a little bit more about these underground structures later. In fact, this unique feature of the church is very rarely addressed, but it's important here to distinguish between the architectural concept of this church and the actual historical practice. Despite its outstanding importance for the history of architecture and art, experts showed a surprisingly vague interest in further developing the considerations on the shape of the building. With a view to the subsequent Justinianic domed buildings of Constantinople, the excavators quickly expressed a hypothesis that a central dome would be the most probable roof solution for the church. And then, subsequently, the building is declared to be an important impulse for the Justinianic domed buildings and even served as the prototype for Hagia Sophia, which is, of course, a circular argument. The two unusually wide foundation strips, which are executed on both sides of the naos, have been considered to be the foundations for 4 massive pillars of a central dome. But actually, the archaeological evidence gives no good reasons for the reconstruction of the dome. Harrison, the excavator himself, wrote in the final publication, quote, "An objection to the dome is that nothing attributable to one was recovered in excavation," end of quote. However, despite justified doubts, the reconstruction of the building with a central dome was long considered the most probable solution, which was mainly justified by these massive and unusual wide foundation strips. Only recently have questions about the reconstruction of the building came increasingly into focus again. The contributions by Jonathan Bardell and their addition of important detailed observations by Venla Kakko have resulted in momentous new reconstruction proposals for this important building. After a renewed evaluation of the archaeological and written findings, Bardell comes to the conclusion that the Polioctus church could not have had a central dome. Instead, he now designs the building as a 5-naved basilica whose central nave was covered with a gable roof and the side naves with corresponding monopitch roofs. The previously puzzling 7-meter wide foundation strips in the church's interior are now, and for the first time, comprehensively explained as substructures of expensive exedra rows on the sides of the naos. Thus, a central argument for the reconstruction of a dome has been invalidated. This breakthrough was also possible because the script-bearing components in connection with the manuscript tradition of the epigrams were taken serious for the first time as the source code for question of reconstructing this building. Even before entering the church, a visitor was confronted with an ekphrasis, which might be translated as a poetic description of this building on the west facade of the church. But there was no archaeological evidence of any remains of these inscriptions. But fortunately, the Valentine Anthology holds informations on the position of the texts, on the building, and even on the mise en page of these verses. Therefore, we know that the text was distributed on 5 panels on the west facade of the church. Here in the picture, you can see a hypothetical reconstruction proposal of this situation by Arne Effenberger from 2019. And he's not trying to give a complete full reconstruction, but just offering a first idea of what we have to expect here. During the excavation work, only 7 large marble blocks with fragments of the interior epigram could be recovered. I show you here one of these inscription blocks as a representative. The specific form of these text carriers allows a reliable reconstruction of the relevant components, and thanks to the complete transcription of the poem, the placement of the text in the church's interior can be at least partially reconstructed. The backbone for this reconstruction of the northern central exedra is formed by 3 blocks of the inscription beams, which are inscribed with the successive verses 30, 31, and 32, and thus undoubtedly recognizable as the original building group. The length and curvature of these blocks allow the precise completion of a round niche consisting of a total of 5 curved blocks, each of which had one verse of the founder's poem chiseled on it. The elaboration of the individual letters of the epigram in these elaborate Argura reliefs presumes that the relevant building elements were already treated on the ground, which means before the blocks were installed in the building structure. This block by block elaboration of the verses is considerably beneficial for the precise production process and the correct arrangement of the texts in the church space. The archaeological remains of 2 facing exedra on either side of the naos interlock so closely and revealing that their reconstruction becomes possible. Of the 7 fragments of inscriptions that became known during the excavations, 6 marble blocks can be reliably assigned to these 2 round niches. And despite these numerous open questions about the constructive connection to the mantle building, the unique and fortunately interlocking situation of building and text finds in Istanbul, Barcelona, and Heidelberg allows the reconstruction of 2 exedra of the church to be reliably undertaken. So we know today the position of the verses 8 to 16 and 27 to 35 in the church space. So let's get back to Nadine's interest in the crypt and in the accessibility of relics in Constantinople. Unfortunately, the archaeological evidence in the eastern part of the structure is much worse preserved than in the western parts, so that many open questions remain for the appropriate reconstruction of these rooms. The elliptical foundation of the ambo has a carefully constructed slanting recess, suggesting that the ambo could be effectively entered from the subterranean corridor. The excavator Harrison associated this access to make provision for a dramatic appearance of relics on the ambo, but this is very unlikely. The unusual size and furnishings of the crypt itself actually suggests that relics stored here and were to be made accessible to a wider public. Thus, the crypt of St. Polioctus Church is without comparison in Constantinople. We know of no other church building in the capital which is equipped with such an enormous underground chambers, whose walls were covered with marble and individual rooms were closable by doors and different accesses. But the question of accessibility is even more problematic in this case. At a later date, the central corridor was closed off. Both accesses of the central corridor in the west and in the east show these careful bricking, which I have on the left side of the slide. The exact date of these blockings is unknown, but the quality of the masonry leads the excavators to assume it happened soon after the church was built. So we have a strange situation. The church of St. Polioctus shows the most spectacular concept for a crypt in the capital, but at the same time, we can only say little about its actual function and accessibility as a sacred space in the late antique topography. To sum up, in the cityscape of 6th century Constantinople, the Church of Polioctus was undoubtedly an unmistakable landmark. But its exterior construction as a basilica may well have been more conservative than long suspected. The details of the interior of this shell therefore remain puzzling in many aspects. And the crypt, with the dramatic long corridor as a unique feature of Byzantine building in Constantinople, but while the design is spectacular, the actual historic accessibility remains questionable. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the other papers and the final discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabian, for your fantastic presentation, and would like to ask Alessandra Ricci to open her presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me and I hope you can see the screen. And thank you, Nadine, for the invitation. Thank you to the German Archaeological Institute for the opportunity you're giving all of us to re-emerge from our caves in the pandemic times. This evening, we will try to see and experience late antique and Byzantine Constantinople through a feature of topography rarely considered. That is through the cities and its surroundings ecological system. It is in this very ecological system that the human action left tangible and intangible signs through the cyclical, meaning also seasonal, presence in time. Left signs also in the manipulation of the terrain and in the adaptive modes of the architectural environment to accommodate, balance, and use the ecology of the city. The horticultures or garden cultures, together with the agricultural cultures of the city and of its surroundings, will be taken into consideration. The examples will be inevitably selective given the length of the presentation, and the perspective will be more archaeological. This approach towards seeing the city of Constantinople in late antiquity and Byzantine times opens, I hope, a window of observation into what we might refer as the intangible topography of the city. However, a word of caution should be put forward here. That is, this is a work in progress exercise composed in the age of pandemic and away from library and research facilities and connections with colleagues. So let us now consider usage of space within and around the land walls since their construction, a subject rarely considered when examining the monument. The elaborate defensive system whose construction began in the early years of the 5th century and which might be summarized here as a tripartite system formed by a moat or a ditch, an outer wall and an inner and higher wall, which formed a barrier of at least 60 meters in width, with an estimated difference of height of circa 30 meters between the bottom of the ditch and the inner tower's parapets, so the bottom of the ditch here, and the inner tower's parapets, extending over a length of circa 5.6 kilometers. In order to accommodate these architectural and earth features, on such a large scale, the terrain had to be progressively prepared with extensive earth removals from the ditch, likely used in parts to create the 2 earth terraces that are placed in front of the outer and inner walls. This was not the only massive and systematic earth removal that affected late antique Constantinople. In fact, the construction of extensive terracing systems to modulate exceedingly slopy areas of the city is documented both in textual evidence and on traces in the terrain. A practice we should consider when reflecting on the ecology of the city and the approach towards it by the late antique builders of these megapolis. Now back to the land walls and to a law dating to 413 in the Theodosian Code 15.1.51. Here, credit for the construction of the Novi Muri is given to the Praetorian prefect Anthemius. The law provides other valuable information about usage of the land walls and its surrounding space. The text focuses on the towers of the Turres Novi Muri, which are here assigned in perpetuity to those through whose lands this wall was duly erected. So reads the law. The area of land used for the construction of the new walls was large, given the width and the length of the defensive system. It is reasonable to assume that the towers of the inner circuit wall were more suitable for private usage. In fact, some of the inner circuit two-story towers show inner terrace level chambers accessible through this entrance you see here from the city side by means of a single large brick-tiered archway. These chambers did not communicate with the chambers above, and their lack of defensive qualities appears evident. Their access was only through a relatively small side entrance, a sort of postern opening into the inner terrace. The southern stretch of the land walls reveals the presence of several ground floor posterns. I'm showing here on the screen a detail of Tower 33 with Müller-Wiener's plan based on Meyer-Platz and Schneider's architectural survey, which continues to remain the most detailed survey of the land walls. This arrangement allowed for limited and controlled movement of individuals and likely of goods and tools, factors that would have made the spaces suitable for the storage of agricultural tools, as well as for temporary stocking of produce. Chapter 12.1 of the Geoponica, a collection of texts on agriculture, amply used by elite proprietors and dedicated to the Emperor Constantine VII, 913-949, was examined among others by Johannes Coder. It lists which vegetables are to be sown and what is to be planted on a month-by-month basis in the region of Constantinople. Some of the vegetables, such as cabbage, crambe, could easily be stored in cold, dark basement spaces without requiring much further attention like curing or drying. In his examination, Coder questions the absence of what at this time would have been common Mediterranean climate vegetables such as olives, broad beans, millet, gourds, and others. But rather than an omission, this absence confirms that the text was specifically composed for the geoclimatic region of Constantinople, which does not afford a full-fledged Mediterranean climate. Coder rightly hypothesized that lands used for agriculture and vegetable gardens to feed the inhabitants of the city, or in part to feed the inhabitants of the city, were spread throughout the small urbanized area between the Constantinian walls and the new land walls, and to the west of the new defensive system that is outside the walls. This suggestion finds further corroboration in textual and architectural evidence of the private usage of several chambers in the land walls towers, which might have been used not only for agricultural tools, but as we said, also for fresh produce. Whereas the orchards of the area of the land walls may have also contributed to the conservation of the monument, other Byzantine period features defining the physical landscape around the monument are long vanished. These are what Henry Maguire defined urban parks. A park known through written sources is that of the Arete. Anna Komnena, daughter of the Emperor Alexios I Komnenos and of Irene Ducas, born in the Great Palace, hence in purple, in 1083, and one of the most important female historians of Byzantium and beyond, locates it, quote, near the city, rising on a ridge, inclining one of its flanks towards the sea and the other one towards Byzantium, end of quote. Maguire associated the description of the area with the 85-line poem by John Guillaume Tresse, active in the second half of the 10th century, in which the virtues of the place are amply described as with beautifully decorated buildings, sculptures, and with formal fountains blending with natural streams. Another poem by Geometres commissioned by Basil II on the occasion of the restoration of Tower 1, which you see on the screen after the earthquake, and there it is, of 989 on the land walls. And I'm here relying on the publication by Andreas Roby, it describes the tower as, quote, standing at the junction between land and sea, adding that it is hexagonal on its upper parts. And here you see traces of the inscription. The last two lines of the poem read, quote, do you wish to know the whole prospect of the tower? Raise your eyes straight, look from nearby at the virtuous aretas of the earth, end of quote. We should, however, be wary of the fact that late antique and Byzantine periods descriptions of gardens and parks contain rather extended ekphrases or description of a work of art, gardens included, which in the absence of evidence, they have been taken as the real evidence. This methodological approach was already debunked by Margaret Alexiou, who stated that, quote, ekphrases of gardens can be a mere rhetorical intrusion into romance, end of quote. So we shall leave this broader topic for the discussion, which I'm sure will follow at the end of this presentation. And I would like now to go back to the presence of agricultural estates within and near urban centers during late antiquity, which are extremely well attested. And for the city of Constantinople, the visibility of its elite landowners is well documented for this period, though largely in the region of Bithynia. And before we briefly move to the Bithynian hinterland of the capital city, I would like to reflect on the area contiguous to the land walls, which we have considered until now, and to reflect on one of the few names we may associate with areas around the land walls in late antiquity, which is that of Studios, consul of the East in 454 and founder of the monastic complex whose plan of the Catholicon you see on the screen and whose construction took place soon after his consular appointment. Little is known about the archaeology of the monastery and of the estate. Only limited archaeological soundings were carried out by the Russian Archaeological Institute of Constantinople in 907 and 909, and by the German Archaeological Institute of Istanbul with the Hagia Sophia Museum in 1979, all of which were accompanied by limited published reports with hardly any photographs, if any. So in both instances, archaeological soundings that took place underneath the church revealed the presence of earlier architectural remains. A structure identified as a tower, spaces decorated with frescoes, and the water channel presumably feeding into the large-sized underground cistern led Peschlo to suggest the existence of a residential complex of the imperial or late Roman periods that was demolished in order to accommodate the monastic complex. A detailed publication of the soundings will certainly shed more light on the archaeology of the site, but we are happy to hear from Fabian that the University of Fribourg is about to put online some of Peschlo's precious photographic archive of his extremely prolific career. A working hypothesis, hence, would see a well-established and structured suburban residential estate of the late Roman period with annex lands, which in the middle of the 5th century was replaced by a monastic complex. This might represent a rare Constantinopolitan example supported by archaeological evidence of the transformation of a residential estate into a monastic community. This might offer the opportunity for 2 further reflections. The first one is about walled monastic and non-gardens inside Constantinople. This topographical feature of the city was amply recognized and documented by Western travelers. The Castilians Ruy González de Clavijo, in the early years of the 15th century, marveled at the mighty size of the city's land walls and noted the presence of vast enclosures with fruit gardens and cornfields. Not too far from the land walls, Clavijo described the monastery of St. John of Studios, whose still functioning monastic community enjoyed vast gardens, vineyards, fountains, and more green spaces. Earlier in the 12th century, Otto of Duel, another Western traveler, reported that the vast cultivated lands by the land walls were producing for the inhabitants of the city. The second and final reflection is on the agricultural cultures of late antique estates first, and of monasteries of the Byzantine period later. This allows us to travel to the Bithynian hinterland of the city, where the monastery of Satyros, built by Patriarch Ignatius during his second tenure at the seat between 867 and 877, became in an autonomous dependency of the imperial monastery of the Pantocrator in the 12th century. Archaeological investigations carried out at the site have allowed to retrieve a series of archaeobotanical assemblages we associate with the complex's later phases of life. Research has shown a closed monastic economy where the cultivation of agricultural food products such as wheat, E and G on the screen, and flax, F again on the screen, was dominant. These largely monoculture agricultural monastic estates located already in the immediate hinterland of the Byzantine capital provided food and revenues to the capital, but also in this case to the imperial house of the Comnenians through the Pantocrator monastery. Satyros may have also included monastic gardens of spiritual dimension with symbolic elements. The relationship of the symbolic to the real when it comes to late antique and Byzantine gardens is still very elusive, a subject that we may leave for the exchanges that will hopefully follow this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. And now I would like to ask our last speaker, Nadine, to start her presentation.
Thank you, Archimedes. I'm going to now share my screen. And now you should be able to see the full presentation. Yeah, we've already were able to listen to 2 wonderful presentations and see really beautiful material. I must say that in my presentation, I'm not going to be able to offer you that kind of evidence, but instead look at texts, which are obviously also very important to understand Constantinople, and give you an introduction into the cult of relics in late antique Constantinople. One of the most famous and well-known facets of Constantinople in the Middle Ages is the city's magnificent collection of holy relics. Constantinople housed what was considered to be part of the true cross on which Jesus was crucified, the crown of thorns, several objects connected to the Virgin Mary, and the bodily remains of apostles as well as of almost countless saints and martyrs. Constantinople in the Middle Ages was a veritable repository for holy relics, until the city was taken and sacked by the Fourth Crusade in 1204. The city's wealth, statues, architectural parts, and the precious relics were taken by the Crusaders and spread all over Europe. But what I will look at today in my presentation is not the period when Constantinople had already firmly established its position as holy treasury. Instead, I will focus on the beginning of this process, the accumulation of relics in late antiquity. In today's introduction, I have already mentioned that Constantinople, after its inauguration by Constantine, was religiously ambiguous. Despite his inclination towards Christianity, Constantine dedicated pagan temples in his newly established imperial city, presenting himself in the likeness of the god Sol Helios. From a Christian perspective, actually, Constantinople didn't have that much to offer in the early 4th century. Other cities in the Roman Empire could look back at a glorious Christian past with apostles having once set foot into their walls, or famous local martyrs. Cities like Jerusalem, Antioch, Ephesus, or Rome by the early 4th century already had established thriving Christian communities. Compared to that, the place formerly called Byzantium was an almost blank slate. With the two local martyrs, St. Mochius and Akakius, those ones couldn't really compete with, for example, Rome's connection with St. Peter and Paul. As the bond between Christianity and the Roman emperors grew stronger in the course of the 4th century, measures were taken to balance out Constantinople's Christian deficit. In order to enhance the city's Christian prestige, in order to form a specifically Christian identity, relics from various places were brought into the city. The first holy objects to arrive in Constantinople were the remains of Saint Timothy, Luke, and Andrew, most likely in the years 356-7. On the initiative of the Emperor Constantius II, they were placed in the Church of the Holy Apostles that already served as a mausoleum to the late Constantine, Constantius's father. After this practice had initially been established, the process of translating relics quickly picked up pace. Various objects were brought into the city and deposited in one of the churches. This process is what I am analyzing in my work at the DAI Istanbul, the translation of relics from various places in the Mediterranean to Constantinople and the construction of a specifically Christian sacred topography. I ask which agents were responsible for the translations. I take a closer look at the objects and how they were authenticated. I examine by what means these objects were integrated into Constantinople's cityscape and what impact they had on their respective surrounding. Eventually, I highlight how the translation itself was performed and commemorated. Today, however, I will give you an insight into one specific aspect of the cult of relics in Constantinople. Having arrived in Constantinople, these holy objects were all but static. Instead, they were further moved within the city, connecting the center and the urban peripheries. By tracing the relics' movement within and around Constantinople, I will hopefully be able to showcase their function and impact on the city's political and religious environment. My first case is the translation of the physical remains of Saint Samuel, the Old Testament prophet, from Jerusalem to Constantinople in 406 AD. The church father Hieronymus describes how Samuel's bones made their way from the Holy Land to their destination. And now we're going to look at some text. I quote item number 1 here. The people of all the churches welcomed them with much joy, as if they beheld a living prophet in the midst of them, so that there was one great swarm of people from Palestine to Chalcedon on the Asian side of the Bosporus. End quote. The Chronicon Paschale from the 7th century gives further evidence on the reception of the relics in Constantinople. That's item number 2. Quote, the remains of Saint Samuel were conveyed to Constantinople by way of the Chalcedonian jetty, with Arcadius Augustus leading the way, and Anthemius, Praetorian prefect and former consul, Emilianus, city prefect, and all the Senate. These remains were laid to rest for a certain time in the Most Holy Great Church, end quote. From these texts, we can gather that the translation of Samuel's relics was a remarkable public event, which caught the people's attention not only in Constantinople, but all along the way. The bones wrapped in a precious container were considered to have the same impact as the prophet himself. Once the procession had reached Chalcedon, no other than the Emperor Arcadius, together with the highest urban magistrates and the Senate, took on the opportunity to welcome the revered guest and lead him into the Most Holy Great Church, the Hagia Sophia, in the city center. This way of integrating a relic into Constantinople can be seen as emblematic. Many other holy objects would be received in a similar manner. A famous ivory carving that is now part of the cathedral treasure in Germany, but seems to have been manufactured in Constantinople, illustrates one such scene. A relic stored in a small container and carried by 2 clerics is carried into Constantinople, is arriving in Constantinople. And part of the procession are members of the imperial family, clearly distinguishable by their royal attire. On the very right, we see a church still under construction with a workman on the roof, the church in which the relic is about to be stored. The tree ivory most probably shows the arrival of the relics of Saint Stephen, initiated by the Augusta Pulcheria, sister of Theodosius II. The ivory's date, however, one must say, is heavily debated and not necessarily contemporary to the event itself. And now return to Samuel's relics. One must add that the Hagia Sophia was by no means their final resting place, as another entry in the Chronicon Paschale tells us. 5 years after the arrival in 411, Samuel's bones were again transferred, this time into what seems to be a newly built church in the extramural quarter of Heptamon, today's Bakırköy, not too far from Atatürk Airport. The Heptamon is worth a closer look. It was located at the 7th mile outside the city center, at the Via Egnatia, the core connection between Constantinople and the West. This area housed a military camp and gathering ground where several emperors, especially in the 4th and 5th centuries, were proclaimed. Furthermore, we know of imperial palaces, a triumphal column for Theodosius II, and an elaborate water supply system, impressive remains of which can still be seen today, the so-called Verdames cistern. Samuel's relics were not the first ones to be stored at Heptamon. Already under the reign of Theodosius I, a church was built for the head of St. John the Baptist, remains of which could be excavated in the 20th century. You see the reconstruction drawing here. The Heptamon was much more than a military ground. It served as a first impression for those approaching the city by land, a space to represent the emperor and the character of the city the travelers were about to enter. By translating the remains of St. Samuel from the city's main church, the Hagia Sophia, into the suburban region, the role of Constantinople as host of precious relics was further emphasized. Another instance, my second example today, sheds further light on how these translations between city center and periphery were performed. In the year 400 AD, again under the reign of Arcadius, the relics of unnamed martyrs were brought from the Hagia Sophia, where they were temporarily stored, to Drupia, a region in the capital's hinterland, about 6 kilometers west of the Theodosian walls. Two sermons by John Chrysostom, then Patriarch of Constantinople and eyewitness of the event, give a vivid description of how the festivities, stretching over several days and attracting a huge and diverse crowd, took place. The people of Constantinople, the magistrates, and even the imperial couple were part of that celebration. Emperor Arcadius and his wife Eudoxia take center stage in John's sermon, and I quote, "Again, even magistrates left behind their carriages and staff bearers and bodyguards and rubbed shoulders with the common people. Even she, the empress, who wears the crown and is dressed in purple, did not suffer to be separated even a little from the relics along the entire journey, but followed the saints like a maid, touching the casket and the veil which covered it. Suppressing all human pride, she has allowed herself to be seen by so many people in the midst of the crowd. She, whom not even the eunuchs serving in the imperial court are allowed to look at," end quote. The lofty empress, usually concealed within the imperial palace, not only took part in the procession, but ostentatiously lowered herself, walking beside the relic like a maiden to showcase her humility and piety in God. On the following day, Arcadius himself joined the celebrations together with his imperial guard, and I quote item number 2. "Even the man who grants benefactions to every person in the world came to enjoy benefactions from these saints and to reap the greatest goods. For this reason then, he put down his crown, and so did all his guards, some their spears, others their shields. And putting aside all the fancy, all of them came with a humble mind as if entering from heaven into, that's way wrong, as if entering from earth into heaven." That makes more sense, end quote. Just like his wife, the emperor demonstrated his piety towards God by temporarily leaving behind his elevated status, in this case by taking off his crown and letting go of his military guard. This instance shows how the imperial family could use the translation of relics as an opportunity to connect with Constantinople's populace. As has been often pointed out in research, this was particularly important at a time when the emperors permanently settled in Constantinople instead of traveling the provinces. Arcadius, who had come to power aged 18 after the death of his father Theodosius I, depended on keeping a firm relationship with the people of Constantinople. The people, a group that gained political weight as the city emerged as second, if not foremost, capital of the Roman Empire. The translation of relics had, one can conclude, not only a religious function, but also a clear political gain to showcase not only the emperor's piety, but also his care for an intimate relationship with the metropolitan people. In this context of translating relics, also imperial women could enter the spotlight and, with their ostentatious piety, contribute to the prestige of the ruling family. The cases of St. Samuel and the nameless martyrs exemplify how the Hagia Sophia in the city center serves as some sort of sacred knot in this process of collecting and dispersing relics. The Hagia Sophia wasn't herself based on relics, because what relics could possibly embody God's holy wisdom to which the church was dedicated. But Hagia Sophia was repeatedly used as a temporary place of veneration for relics that were then distributed to other, less famous shrines. The ritual of translating the relics from Hagia Sophia to their final resting place in the urban periphery established a sacred network between city center and urban periphery that was commemorated and thus kept alive in Constantinople's liturgical calendar. With my first two cases here, I have covered bodily or physical relics. My third case, in contrast to that, concerns what in research is labeled a secondary or contact relic. In this case, the robe or the veil of the Virgin Mary. A relic that was stored at Constantinople's Blachernite Church right outside the Theodosian walls. Southwest of the church complex, elevated on a steep slope, sat an imperial palace here. I hope you can see that on the map. Unfortunately, not much is left of these buildings today, neither of the church nor of the imperial palace. The Blachernite church burned down shortly before Constantinople was taken by the Ottomans. In the 19th century, a much smaller church was built on the spot, incorporating a holy spring that had already been part of the site in late antiquity. What's still visible today is the terrace walls behind the church on which the palace was located. You can see that here and here in an older picture. In the early 7th century, the Emperor Heraclius ordered an extension of the land wall to be built in order to protect the Blachernite quarter. This fortification was even further extended under the reigns of Leo V and Manuel Komnenos, and that's that part here on the map. In the case of the Virgin's robe, the relic's arrival in Constantinople is difficult to reconstruct. All of the accounts we have on this event date centuries later and often contain legendary elements. It seems most likely that the relic was brought to Constantinople in the 5th century and that a first church was built at the initiative of the Emperor Leo I and his wife Verena in the 460s or 70s. Justin I, in the early 6th century, extended the site by adding a large basilica to the small chapel that housed the relics. As you can see here on the reconstruction drawing, here the source, the small chapel, and the large basilica. Today, I'm not going to discuss the relic's initial translation to Constantinople, but take a closer look at an incident in the early 7th century. In 623, the Avars, who by that time settled north of the Danube, once again invaded Thrace and even plundered the western outskirts of Constantinople. Facing this threat, the Patriarch Sergios ordered the Virgin's robe, the precious relic, to be brought into the city, together with other objects from the still unfortified quarter of Blachernite. A detailed account of this event is given in a sermon, probably composed by Theodosius, a high-ranking cleric and an eyewitness. In this text, we find crucial information on how the relic was stored in its shrine. And that's the text you see here, I quote. Inside the visible casket, which was made of gold and silver, was found a stone casket shining with brightness. And inside that, at the top was found lying the divine treasure preserved safe in another little casket, end quote. Virtually nothing of late antique relics or reliquaries from Constantinople is left today. But this description makes it possible to draw on comparative material. Like the set of reliquaries from the Varna Museum. This leads to the conclusion that holy relics as such, once inserted into this church space, were concealed from the view of the congregation. And that interlocks very nicely with what Fabian has said on the church and the crypt in St. Polioctus. So it was concealed from the view of the congregation, in this case here, by various containers, like a little Russian doll. The relic's presence, of course, was indicated through the precious material of the reliquary and was certainly felt by the people that gathered in the church. In 623, due to the Avar raid, the innermost casket with the Virgin's robe was brought to the Hagia Sophia for safekeeping. A couple of months later, as the Avar had withdrawn, the Patriarch ordered the relic to be restored to Blachernite, and that's what we're going to look at now. Again, that's from Theodosius, item number 1, I quote. He, the Patriarch, called together in a lofty degree all the assembly of Patriarch, the clergy and the laity, men and women, and those holding offices and ranks, and all who lived in private life. Here, priests and people, he said, come and see the treasure till now hidden, end quote. Once the procession had reached the Plachana church, the patriarch, in front of the gathered people, opened the casket where, I quote, the casket where he found imperial purple wrapped with myrrh and other perfumes. And opening that, he found the robe of the true empress, the mother of God, shining out with her own grace and power. The divine robe, woven from perishable wool, had suffered no destruction at all, but was completely intact, whole and indestructible, end quote. The relics restitution to Plachana was used as an opportunity to reveal the usually hidden relic to the broad public. Centuries after its initial deposition in the church, the relic was, one could say, reactivated. The fact that the fabric was undefiled, like the Virgin herself, served in front of everyone's eyes as a token for the relic's authenticity. Only 3 years later, the Plachana shrine stood in the spotlight again. In 626, Constantinople could fight off a double siege by Avars and Persians. Contemporary sources are in agreement that it was no other than the Virgin Mary herself who had saved the city from her shrine in Plachana, where she was embodied by her robe. From the liminal space around the city walls, the relic took on the function of protecting the city. According to Theodosius, it was, quote, the most holy gift which the Theotokos has given to the city for its safety, end quote. Wrapping up this presentation, one could say that the translation of relics was a ritual of unveiling. Unveiling the relics that became visible, at least in their precious container, to the people gathered in the streets, but also of unveiling members of the imperial family who usually stayed in their palace, withdrawn from the people's eyes, emperor and empress taking the opportunity to show themselves as pious members of the community. By the early 5th century, holy relics had become a means to strengthen the bond between the capital and its hinterland and extend Constantinople's sacred topography beyond the limits of the city walls. They, the relics, formed the basis of the city's Christian prestige and buttressed its position as capital of the Roman Empire. In the liminal space around the Theodosian walls, the Virgin's robe served in the minds of the people as some kind of palladium to safeguard the city from external threats. So that was my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to unshare my screen, and I think we can now move into the joint Q&A.
Exactly, Nadine. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I also want to thank all speakers tonight for their highly interesting papers. And with that, I would like to open the floor for discussions. I again would like to ask the audience to make their questions in written form, either in the chat function or the F&A, as the format of the webinar does not allow us to see who possibly raises its hand, and or as well as allows the audience to speak. So I would like to ask you to write your questions. Meanwhile, we have already our first questions. I'm going to read them. The first from the chat function. They are for the first question is for Fabian. What is the location of this area of the church named in Istanbul where the church is located today? I mean, the name of the district in Istanbul of Polioctus.
Yeah, the modern name is Saraçhane, and it's the Saraçhane Park today. So I'm not sure about the current situation, if it's possible to enter the area of the site. My last trip to Istanbul, I remember it was closed, but maybe the Istanbulis can answer this thing more competent.
A couple of months ago, it was open actually, so you could walk within the foundations, but I don't know whether that's a regular thing or just by chance.
Then I have another question for Fabian. Also, congratulations. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk, Fabian. The discussion of the crypt space is much needed in the scholarship on this exceptional important building. So this is very exciting. But then there is a question by my colleague Ulrich Mania. On the underground passageways of the Polioctus church, it served as a representative storage of relics, how it was illuminated, and what are the arguments for this interpretation. Fabian, you were so kind to already answer some questions appearing here and there, but could you possibly answer them again for the wider audience?
Of course, thank you very much. This is a very good question, the question of lightning and the interpretation of this area as a storage room for crypts. Actually, there is not that vivid discussion on this interpretation. Polioctus Church is offering so many exciting aspects for the field of research. Sculpture, the epigrams, there's also the idea of a new Templum Salomonis, which I see a little bit critical. So that there has not been a very intense discourse about this crypt thing. The illumination of these underground spaces is, of course, a question which is true for all the crypts and underground situations. So I have not a concrete answer for this, but there should be something. This is all I can offer now. The construction is too monumental and too big to not be used as a passage and to not be used in a way. It's the height of these substructures is about 5 meters. It has been vaulted, so it's not these kind of tiny corridor where you have to cradle through something. It's really a built space.
Thank you. Then there is another question for you by Glenn Garrett. Please, can you tell us the size of the blocks which were found and the possible dimensions of the whole church?
Well, the main building is 50 to 50 meters, around 50 to 50 meters. I don't have the exact measurements in my mind. And with the atrium together, it's a full construction of 100 meters to 50 meters. The size of the blocks, I'm not sure which blocks are meant now. I guess this should be the blocks with the inscription, I suppose. And also there, I don't have the concrete measurements. I think I remember right when I say that the whole construction of one of these exedra, which I have shown, is about 15 to 18 meters. So, yeah.
Then there is a question by Chidem Özkan Aygun. Till which century Hagia Sophia continued to be a first deposit for the relics, and do you know where they are kept? I don't know who wants to answer that question.
I guess the relics is for me. I'm gonna try to answer it, although I must say there's no clear answer to your very interesting question, because I think the Hagia Sophia was used as a temporary and also a permanent storage for relics throughout the Byzantine centuries, basically. The question of where they were kept is also a bit unclear, but we could imagine, for example, that they were kept, some of them were kept in the Scoiapholakion, so in this kind of treasury, and that there were sometimes, so there's evidence, textual evidence, that sometimes from the Scoiapholakion they were taken out and presented to the congregation that gathered in the church. But I think this core position of Hagia Sophia for the storage and dispensation of relics, that's really something that goes on through the whole Byzantine period. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Then a question by Judith Herring goes again back to Aios Polioctus. could the bricked up walls at Polioctus be a correction to carry the weight of the superstructure?
Thank you very much for this question, and best regards to London. I don't think so. It's a very monumental substructure, the whole thing. And these tiny bricked walls are not that big. I think their only function should be to block the entrance in the corridor from both sides, west and east. And the only argument by the excavators for this early dating is actually, as far as I remember right, is actually the quality of these walls, the quality of bricking, which is, of course, in Constantinople, a very complicated argument. Qualified walls are running there for a longer time than in other places. So also the dating of these walls is disputable and should be investigated. Maybe there is a chance to do this once. Thank you.
Thank you. A question by Alfredo Calahora for Nadine. Do you have any thoughts on the Tria ivories dates and the people represented there?
I think there are people much better qualified than me to answer this question. It's highly debated. So I think from my perspective, it's quite clear who's represented. I think who's represented is, as I said in my presentation, is the relics of Saint Stephen that arrived in Constantinople, initiated by the Empress or the Augusta Pulcheria, together with her brother, the Emperor Theodosius II. However, from what I read, papers by art historians who are better in the matter than I am, it seems plausible that the ivory carving as such is from the 8th or 9th century, so that it's a post-iconoclastic item that depicts an event that happened a couple of centuries prior. So I think that's all I can say, but there's some very interesting discussion on that in the literature. So if you want to have a bibliography on that, please get in touch. I can offer it to you.
And also Spencer Woolley asks, what role do you see Empress Helena in moving Constantinople from less religious ambiguity towards a more firmly Christian polity?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question, but also a tricky one, because my impression is that a lot of accounts on Empress Helena have these legendary elements that retrospectively she's kind of made into this almost saintly figure who drives her son Constantine towards a more Christian life and so on and so forth, finding the relics of the True Cross in Jerusalem and also sending part of the True Cross to Constantine for him to keep. The thing is, if you look at the evidence, you can figure out that some of it is from the from the 4th century, but already kind of enhanced by these legendary aspects. So I think Helena is an important figure. However, when it comes to the Christianization, I would be very cautious, because I think it's rather something that is enhanced retrospectively than in the event as such.
Thank you. There was also a question to Alessandra Ricci by Judith Herrin, which she was so kind to answer already. I'm going to read it out. Does the Japonica describe the planting of wheat and flax and other crops that were grown in Constantinople? And do you want to reply it again and say something more, Alessandra, or shall I read out your answer from the chat?
I don't want to take time from, I see there's a long line of questions. It's so difficult to keep track of them. So apologies if I don't manage to answer. Yes, the flax and wheat are mentioned, but also linen is mentioned and flax. Excuse me. So what I find really interesting is the archaeobotanical data that is emerging from our excavation, which is really showing a nice connection with the text of the Geoponica. this also, the fact of monocultures is rather important, because we tend to think of monocultures in Byzantine times and associate them with lands that are removed far away from the capital city. They're sort of in a peripheral location, but we now understand that this kind of crops were extensively cultivated already in the immediate suburbs of the city. And they traveled rather well to the city, either by means of land, but more importantly, by means of water through the Sea of Marmara and through the network of monastic estates that were, around the Sea of Marmara. What I want to say is that the archaeobotanist Buran Ulash, who is collaborating with us at the project at Küçükyalı, is currently studying also remains from the Beşiktaş rescue excavations, which are dating to the Byzantine period. As you know from the news, a deep pit was dug in the area of Beşiktaş, dating to late antiquity, with extremely well-preserved baskets with seeds. We don't know if those seeds came by means of water from outside the city of Constantinople, or whether, and sold at local markets there, or whether they may have been, objects of local cultivations. But what Buran is doing, he is working on them, and a publication in English on this is due to appear on the next issue of Archéologie ve Sanat periodical. So those of you who might be interested, I encourage you to look up for Buran's article.
Thank you very much. Then there is a question for Nadine. Do we have any textual sources that mention how the cult of relics were perceived by non-Christians? As I know, Julian the Apostate wasn't very keen on how Christians ran their funerals and perceived death. Do we know if that attitude extends to relics as well?
Turn the mic on. I think one can say that they found it super weird, this cult of relics. I mean, from a non-Christian perspective, it must have been absurd almost, because they basically dug up their graves and paraded around their bones. And I think the non-Christian found that rather puzzling. So I think Julian the Apostate is not the only one expressing his concern, maybe, about this practice. So yeah, I mean, I think there's various accounts from the 3rd and 4th century about people also criticizing that Christian practice.
Thank you. Then there is a question for both Alessandra and Fabian. Can you say something about the roles of Ayesma in what you have presented? What role they may have played in green spaces, so for you, Alessandra, and if there is evidence for a holy spring at the Church of Saint Polioctus, Fabian. So, ladies first.
Okay. There was a section of my presentation which included the Agiasma of the Peggy, immediately to the west of the land walls. But since we only had 20 minutes, I decided to keep it out. And I hope that maybe the German Archaeological Institute may consider having a workshop on the role of water in Byzantine Constantinople, because water had a lot of important properties for the city. First of all, there was a lack of potable water in the city, but it was also a sacred element in the early life of the city. So the agiasmata of the city were important points of reference in the not only as part of movement and pilgrimage inside the city, but as part of healing processes and practices that continue well into the Byzantine times. What I want to say is that the Catholicon of the monastery of Satyros, which we excavated until 2018, had an atrium which may have likely been equipped with a central form of water, like a fountain or something like this, which is very similar to what we later see at the Church of St. George at the Mangane inside the city. So we should not exclude that some of these important buildings equipped with atria may have also had some forms of water springs and fountains that had spiritual connections.
And I would agree, Alessandra, that water in churches and water in the town would be a topic worth to study again and to get in touch. For Hagios Polioctus, it's a case that we have a lot of later constructions on the site, and there are also some deep holes looking for water in the excavation area. And there's one, if I remember right, in the northeastern part of the church, there's one construction which could be something like this, but there's nothing in something like in the main axis of the church, so that we could think that there's a hiasma in St. Polioctus.
Thank you. Then there's a question. Why did Helena's true cross relics end up in the Ekatondabiliani of Pharos rather than in Constantinople?
I don't think I really can answer that question. The thing is, I think if you put together all the pieces that allegedly come from the true cross, you would get a structure that is at least 50 meters high. So I think it's a kind of common practice in the Middle Ages, but also later, to kind of claim having that kind of piece of relic. So I really don't know about that specific one. So one would have to trace back the history of that tradition or that tradition. But yeah, I think the point is, my favorite example is that all around Europe and the Middle East, there exist at least 3 heads of St. John the Baptist. And I mean, you can question which one is the true one, but I guess that is that's not the point. I think as long as the people who are around it relic believe that it's the head or part of the cross that kind of serve its function. Yeah.
Thank you. Then there's a question to Alessandra by Mark Hammond. The semi-rural nature of the city within the walls is sometimes claimed to be an aspect of its decline. Do you think there were always a sizable garden or agricultural elements to the layout of Constantinople?
Yeah, it's a very big question. We shouldn't forget that this was the most extended city of antiquity, which surpassed the city of Rome, for example, by several sizes. I feel that we have collectively the tendency of looking at the edges or the fringes of the city by the land walls, and we tend to look at them as fringes, like the end of the city with the walls marking really a line between the urban space and the suburban space. In reality, I feel that this was a much softer relationship, and which involved a rather extended amount of green and horticultural spaces inside the city, which in later Byzantine times are associated with the urban monasteries, but which form the characteristic of the city. I don't see it as an element of decline. I see it as a defining character of late antique and later on Byzantine Constantinople. So I don't know if I've answered the question well enough, but I also like to encourage reading of Eric Day's book on late antique Rome and the relationship between the suburbium and the urbs of Rome at the same point in history, in which we understand that these categories are much more fluid than we tend to think of in contemporary historiographical terms.
Thank you, Alessandra. Then there is a question on the Church of Saint Polioctus for Fabian. Is the Church of Saint Polioctus forerunner of the Hagia Sophia as a domed church in your idea? And how can one find the studies about the church, and if it's possible to get your results of your studies?
So you're welcome. That's actually the best thing to happen during a conference, to get in touch with people into exchange. The idea that Polioctus is a forerunner of Hagia Sophia is an old narrative in the Byzantine archaeology. And when the excavation, at the beginning of the excavations, there's actually has been published a plan by Martin Harrison, where he projected the structure of Hagia Sophia onto the foundation of Polioctus. And which I try to show in the presentation is that this older narrative of having a dome structure seems to be untrue, and that we more have to understand this building in the meaning of basilica. And there's also an older narrative that there is something like a rivalry between Annika Juliana and Justinian. And this has shaped the research in terms of the epigraphy, in terms of the architectural sculpture and the architecture. And I'm not a big fan of this, these narratives, because I think they are flattening the complex situation in 6th century Constantinople. There's a wonderful German term of Zufall der Überlieferung, so that we have some churches in the city and that the archaeology tends to bring these architectures into a fitting narrative. This does not mean that this has to be actually true. But if we get in touch, just write me an email, then we can exchange ideas.
Thank you very much, Fabian. Then there are two questions by Parit Baravano. One to Alessandra. How did the central power manage the agricultural production of the urban estates?
Yes, this is, Davide, it's a $1 million question. What I can tell you is that the Typicon, so the Monastic Foundation Act of the Pantocrator Monastery, so it's a 12th century document. It provides us some information on how an urban monastic estate controlled its dependencies and the flux of agricultural revenues into the city. So basically, for example, these nearby monastic estates were, first of all, producing for themselves and for the villagers that were part of the network of production. Once they took care of their community and they invested for candles, for liturgical activities, and for the liturgical calendar, whatever represented the surplus was sent back to the main monastic house in the city, in this case, to the monastery of the Pantocrator. As for the urban horticultural activities, we know that in the 5th century, the local owners of the lands that were expropriated for the construction of the walls were given the lower floors of the towers I have discussed in my presentation. But we don't know the size of this land ownership in the city of Constantinople. It's very hard to track down, particularly for the late antique period, the extension of these horticultural quote-unquote estates. And I think there's more work that needs to be done. So I'm sorry if I haven't fully answered your question.
And to Nadine, during the Arab conquests, how did the imperial ideology use the unveiling of relics in respect of the difficulties of the eastern provinces, if it did at all?
Yeah, I think it did. I must say that I myself am not that familiar with the Middle Byzantine evidence, being an ancient historian basically, but I know that we have evidence that, for example, the robe of the Virgin Mary from the Pauliers church was taken out of the church, paraded on the city walls in times of siege, when Constantinople was besieged by enemies, and later it was even taken on military campaigns, so that the emperors would take it on campaign as, again, a sort of palladium. So, and that, as you say very rightly, that this was also an act of unveiling, like showing the relic as way to kind of motivate the soldiers, for example. Yeah, so that was definitely a recurring element.
Thank you. A question by Felix Pearson. Thank you to all speakers. I would like to ask Alessandra if the gardens in between the walls might have been part of the comprehensive defense system, including the provision of food during long-term sieges. Do written sources tell anything in this regard?
We don't have a lot of information for the late antique period, but we know, for example, that this massive and monumental defensive system was not equipped with a large military presence. So we tend to associate this structure with a mighty military outlook, but in reality, it is its architectural and defensive monumentality that made the defense itself. I have the impression that these horticultural undertakings along the walls immediately to the west of the moat, but also to the east of the walls, were constantly ongoing activities throughout the centuries, and that they provided with some level of fresh produce to the city and to its population, also at times of sieges, of difficulties in communication and movement of goods, which it's something that matches also somewhat with what happened in the Western counterpart of some of the medieval cities.
Thank you very much. A question to Nadine. The Church of Pharos in the Great Palace, what was its role with respect to the important relics that it kept, especially since the people's access to them was limited?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I must say that this Chapel of Pharos is something that comes later than the period that I'm studying. It started, I'm not exactly sure when it started, but later than the 7th century. And it was definitely some kind of repository within the palace. And as you said in your question, it's interesting to see that it's not something that was approachable, at least to some extent, by the congregation, as would have been the case in the Pauliers church, where everyone could kind of, to some extent, approach the reliquary. So Yeah, I think the Pharos Temple is one of the core treasuries for Relics, and there you can also see the intimate connection that Relics had to the emperor and kind of buttressing the emperor's power as vice regent of God, so to speak. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Now I'm switching to the F and the A function. So these were the questions in the normal chat, but there had been a few questions made twice. So in both functions, I'm trying to fish out those ones which we have not yet heard. To Fabian, dear Fabian, could you tell more about those steps leading from the underground corridor to the ambo?
No.
Short answer.
No, no. Actually, they're the best. Well, the excavators mentioning these steps and the idea of Harrison that this is something like a dramatic possibility to show relics on the ambo is, I think, absolutely wrong, because you are not able, if this communication between this corridor and the nave of the church really existed, then you are only able to enter under the ambo. So the ambo is a structure sitting on pillars, and this little staircase is just giving the access under this structure. So the question is if this is more something like a functioning access, practical thing, or if there is something like a need for a choir to enter under the ambo. I think it's not connected to the relics. And it's difficult to say more about because we don't have comparable findings.
Thank you. Then there is a question by David Hendricks, of whom we showed some, or you showed some photographs today. What are your thoughts about the claims of Persian influence in its designs for St. Polioctus?
Thank you, David, for this question. It's actually a thing I made very short today. I did not really speak about the architectural sculpture and this concept or the ideas of the field to explain these very strange and unknown motifs and ornaments. And there's a very strong argument for a long time now that there's a Sasanian influence or Persian influence in a way. This argument actually is much older than the most people think. Even Josef Strigowski in the early 20th century brought up this argument when he saw for the first time the Pilastri Acritani in Venice. Strigowski, without knowing that there is Polioctus church, he thought that these pillars should not come from Akkon. He thought they come from Antioch, because for him this is already visible in this spinning ornaments. On the other hand, this argument has a problem because there has been famous research, for example, by Christine Strube on this point and others. All the examples that are brought up from Sasanian art are younger than Polioctus, which makes it methodologically complicated to see a forerunner in the Sasanian. But it's still a very successful argument. And yeah, I'm not able to give a clear answer to this. It's an open and problematic field.
Thank you. And another question for you. Are there other lost churches in Constantinople, and what are the prospects of finding them in future?
Okay, this is a nice question for a guy sitting in Germany. I think if there will be a major, well, this is a complicated question actually. If they have further major construction projects in the city, there is a chance that some things will be discovered. This is my answer.
Thank you. Then there's a question to Alessandra. How the construction and the placement of triumphal monuments came to shape the particular urban environment of late antique Constantinople.
So what I was trying to say in 2 sentences during my presentation is that, you know, the adaptation of the topography of Constantinople to the monumental needs of the late antique city, it's a rather widespread phenomenon. So imagine that some of the slopes are rather steep, and imagine the Forum Tauri and its extension towards the Sea of Marmara, which required the arrangement of a series of, let's say, terraced substructures in order to enable extension of the square, in that direction. The same applies to the area of the Great Palace. And in a certain sense, a similar, so this had a major impact, I think, in the shaping of the late antique city. And I feel that also in the region of the Ios Polioctus, where the hill slopes towards the south of the complex we have been looking at today, there must have been the need of create a certain type of foundation structures that would have been able to accommodate, the monumentality of the building. So this is something that connects the city of Constantinople with Roman traditions of terraced areas, of substructures, which here gets multiplied by a lot, because the monumentality of late antique Constantinople is extraordinary. So you have to imagine this happening in various areas of the city, and to this add also all the underground cisterns that whose construction oftentimes required such terrain adjustments. So this was a heavy manipulation of the ecology of the city, which we rarely think about, but I was trying to make us think about it tonight when I mentioned this in 2 short sentences.
Thank you. A question to Fabian. Any opinions regarding the possibility of Ios Polioctus being intended to either house or perhaps temporarily store the temple treasure that arrived in Constantinople probably around 533?
No opinion, no. There's no archaeological evidence, so yeah.
Thank you for this short answer. But we can proceed to the next question to Nadine. To what extent can the translation of these relics also be described as a sign of the ruler's power? Could everybody move these relics from one place to another?
I think it could very much be described as a sign of the ruler's power. I mean, kind of demonstrating the ruler's connection to this transcendental level, to the relics, through the relics to God. So that was definitely the case, although I must say that the translating relics was by no means a prerogative of the emperors. So that's one thing that I also aim at doing in my project, that I gather all the material and ask for the ages, like who was it? And I think if one gathers all the evidence one had for the 4th to 7th century, then one can make better statements on how often was it the emperor or members of the imperial family, and which other people were involved in that, for example, clerics or high-ranking magistrates, members of the Senate, so on and so forth. So I can't give you a definitive answer to that question, but it was definitely a demonstration of power in a way that power was connected to God at that time. Thanks.
Thank you. The next question is there any real material belonging to Saint Mary or Jesus in any church in Istanbul or under any column? or has there been any taken to any museum anywhere in the world? Who wants to answer this question?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the question of real, then this is difficult anyway. And I mean, I'm not assessing whether these relics were real or not. It depends on whether the people at that time believed that they were real. And for example, one can say that like all over Europe, all over the world, probably there are pieces of the true cross dispersed. For example, one nice example is the crown of thorns that Jesus wore during the crucifixion that is moved from Constantinople to Paris and was then stored in Notre Dame de Paris before it burned down. So of course you could ask whether that's the real one or not, but yeah, I think what's so interesting is that this had such a big impact that more and more of these objects were discovered and distributed all over Europe, the Near East, and even further than that.
Thank you very much. And another question for you is, what do you think about the reliability of Chronicon Pascale, about the translation of the relics of Saint Samuel in 406 to Saint Sophia, given the church was almost destroyed 2 years before?
That's a good question. I must admit I haven't thought about it. Thanks for drawing my attention to it. Well, of course, you could say like 2 years is probably not enough to rebuild the entire church. But one could ask, for example, so how much of the church was actually destroyed? Was maybe the Scoipholakion or part of the church structure still existing? And the thing is, the reason why I still think it's authentic that the piece was stored in the Hagia Sophia or like a building adjacent and belonging to the Hagia Sophia is that we have so much evidence, so much other evidence on how the Hagia Sophia serves as this core repository for relics. So it's not the only occasion we have or the only instance we have. So based on that, I would say, I mean, you're absolutely right. I have to think about it, but still, I think in general, I would think it's plausible and authentic. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Then I'm surprised by the transfer of the relics of St. Samuel to a church outside the walls. This seems a risky placement in terms of security. Could you review your explanation?
Yeah, I mean, one must say that from the perspective of the 4th or 5th century, it wasn't that risky, one must say. I mean, that incursions into Thrace or general kind of like barbarian threats, that's something that really came later than that. In the 6th and 7th century, it became really precarious. But in general, one must be aware that even though we have these massive fortifications, there's a lot going on outside the walls, west of Constantinople. I mean, I talked about that quarter of Heptamon, where we had not only an imperial palace and military training and gathering ground, but also like monumental architecture, like a column for Theodosius II. So I wouldn't think that what's outside the walls is necessarily like constantly threatened by incursions. So I think it's still quite plausible the way that I tried to make sense of it. And I think in later times it becomes a bit different in the Middle Byzantine times when Thrace was much more threatened by Arab incursions that came over the sea, by way of the sea. But I think for late antiquity, it makes absolute sense that they try to extend their reach over the land walls. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Question to Fabian. What do we know of Anicia's palace by her church?
Not that much. We assume that the palace is next to it, and there's this very nice and interesting architecture on the atrium, which offering something like an upper storage gallery accessibility. But as far as I know, that's it for the moment.
Thank you very much. And the 2 last questions I can see, at least. I hope I didn't oversee any questions. Is there any connection between the substructure complexity beneath early basilicas and the subsequent practices of suppers and the undermining of fortifications during siege activities? Do you know who wants to answer that question? Maybe Alessandra or?
I see Fabian is saying no, but yes, I agree. Yeah. I didn't see the name of the person who asked this question. Keep in mind also that some of these substructures, not only did they regulate the terrain, but they also provided these buildings with a platform on which their architectural visibility was enhanced. So this is another important consideration to make about, some of these, let's call them substructures, polyfunctional or multifunctional substructures.
Thank you for answering the question, Alessandra. And I'm now making the last question to Nadine. What do you think about the locations of the Constantinople church in early Byzantine period? Is there any linkage between the spaces and the population of the city? Or is there any corrections with the sacred space, which was already a cult of pagans? What is the reason for being chosen these locations?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, so the pagan temples that we had in Byzantium and also in the beginnings of Constantinople were all at the very kind of top of this peninsula. So you could say that is to some extent there's a continuity that also, of course, the Hagia Sophia and Hagia Irene, which is also very early, kind of occupy at least a similar space. But to my knowledge, there's no real evidence for where exactly these pagan temples stood. So I can't make a point on like that something was really transformed, like a pagan site was transformed into a Christian site. But when we look at other examples, for example, the also Constantinian ones, the Church of Holy Apostles was like way out the old city center. So there something very new was established. I think there's again this balance between referring to the past and also building up something new that we have here in order to build up that specifically Christian sacred space. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nadine. Well, this was a very extensive discussion, I have to say, which actually just reflects how interesting this topic is. And I would like to thank all speakers for their interesting papers and also for answering these numerous questions for this vivid discussion. And of course, also I would like to thank the audience for attending to today's evening lecture. And I think it was highly successful and we learned a lot about sacred space and topography in late antique Constantinople. So with that, thank you very much again to the speakers. And I wish you all a nice evening and hope to welcome you to also to our next evening lectures. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.